And it is our duty, therefore, as Africans to begin to rethink.
In July 2023, the economic freedom fighters turned 10 years old. From political obscurity, they had risen to become South Africa's third largest party. To celebrate, they hired a room in the University of Cape Town and invited a Kenyan man to talk about Pan-Africanism. But as he got up to speak, protesting students could be heard outside. In fact, the EFF's guest had made headlines across South Africa before he even arrived. According to headlines, he was a controversial anti-gay scholar, and yet EFF was known in South Africa for its pro-LGBTQ+ stance. So why had the party invited him? Julius Malema's friendship with PLO Lumumba went back several years. As EFF parties opened across Africa, Malema looked to connect with notable Pan-Africanists like Lumumba. Several years earlier, the Kenyan had been invited to give a first lecture to EFF on African history.
Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt was a great Pan-Africanist.
But in May 2023, something happened in Uganda, and Malema and Lumumba found themselves on opposite sides of the fence. Uganda's new anti-LGBTQ+ bill has been controversial within Africa and beyond. Western nations were quick to condemn it, whilst in South Africa, Julius Malema's EFF protested outside the Ugandan embassy. But PLO Lumumba congratulated President Museveni on X for defying Western countries and doing the right thing. When, a month later, the EFF invited Lumumba to their 10th birthday party, the South African press was quick to pick up on this public difference of opinion. In an interview with South Africa's state broadcaster a month before the event, Lumumba said he stood by his words, but this didn't mean he should be disinvited.
I know many people, many friends with whom I do not share views on many things, but when we disagree in an agreeable manner.
In the end, Lumumba's Cape Town speech lavished praise on the EFF, making no mention of gender, sexuality, or freedom of speech. Although he has an academic background, Lumumba is less a social crusader and more a politician. At his speech in South Africa, he was introduced as
a leader in his own right.
In fact, Lumumba has become a kind of African statesman without a state. His support for Museveni's harsh laws came in the context of a long-running friendship with the Ugandan president. In September 2022, he was invited to deliver a speech in Uganda where he addressed Museveni directly.
To use this occasion to address you directly with due respect.
This is PLO Lumumba's strange story. How he was rejected by his own, and how he took over the online Afrosphere. It's also the story of his plan. A plan to steal back Africa. But perhaps not from who you think. Patrick Loh Otieno Lumumba was born in Usenge. He was named after Congo's tragic first president, Patrice Lumumba, who had been killed in a Western-backed coup a year earlier. Lumumba's family moved to Kenya's capital, Nairobi, and the boy quickly showed promise in school. Lumumba rapidly moved through the academic world, gaining an undergraduate in Nairobi and a master's in law in Dar es Salaam before completing a doctorate in Belgium. Back in Kenya, Lumumba continued down a legal academic path, but his ambitions went far beyond the university. He helped to create several civil society groups and a charitable foundation. In 2004, he made his first serious entry into the political arena, helping to draft a new constitution for Kenya. The 2005 national referendum saw President Kibaki campaign in favour of the new constitution. Sadly for Lumumba, 58% of Kenyans voted against the changes. In 2007, Lumumba experienced politics at the grassroots, as he tried and failed to win a seat as a Member of Parliament. But in 2010, it looked like his big political break had finally come. He was appointed as director of the Kenyan Anti-Corruption Commission. You cannot run a country whose creed is greed, and the duty of those of us who have been given the honour and privilege to be the arrow's head in the fight against corruption is to change that creed. Lumumba immediately ruffled feathers. Senior government ministers started stepping down as the commission opened cases against them. Lumumba's commission took on so many cases, so quickly, that there was soon a sizable body of MPs who harboured grievances against him. Others worried they might be the next target of Lumumba's suspicions. The political backlash was so severe that a new bill was passed, replacing the commission with a new body with less power. Lumumba and his staff were dismissed, a year after being appointed. The anti-corruption arrow was snapped in two.
Upon being appointed, I assumed that my mandate was to go out there and fight the corrupt. But the truth was that I was not supposed to fight corruption. I was supposed to appear to be fighting corruption.
Invited to speak at the Third African Anti-Corruption Convention in Uganda in 2013, Lumumba spoke freely, directly, and harshly about corruption in Africa, pouring out the frustrations of his time in politics.
We live in a continent today where, as the young man has said, our young women upon attaining puberty cannot afford sanitary pads, but our public servants have iPads which they do not know how to use.
After years spent teaching university students, Lumumba's passion for Africa's next generation became a running theme in his speeches. The corrupt politicians who used leverage and petty crime to get what they wanted were responsible for driving disenfranchised African youth into the ocean on dangerous journeys to Europe and America. As Lumumba became a household name at conventions across the continent, people began to suggest he write his ideas down. In 2016, Stolen Moments was published, but it wasn't quite what people were expecting. Instead of a list of problems and solutions, Lumumba had written a story. Stolen Moments begins with Agwati, an intelligent man with legal training, not unlike the author. Agwati writes a PhD called Stolen Moments, in which he identifies points in his country's history where corrupt individuals stole something. Independence should have been a moment of national unity, but it was stolen by politicians who used foreign funding and ethnic tensions to divide the nation. The thesis is so controversial it is banned, and Agwati is forced to flee to Europe. But Europe proves a false hope as he struggles to find clients who trust a black African lawyer. Parallel to Agwati is the character of Sabina, who endures terrible injustice and suffering. Married to an older man at a young age, she becomes a widowed mother whilst at university. On graduating, she struggles to find work because of ethnic prejudice and bosses who demand favours. She too leaves home for a foreign land, going to work for a wealthy family in Saudi Arabia. After experiencing unspeakable abuse, she eventually chooses to end it all. Agwati's story continues as his country creates a new constitution, which promises a multi-party democracy. He returns home to campaign as a politician, but discovers that this moment too is being stolen away. The president has created a youth movement which is bribing and threatening people into voting. The once united opposition is divided by ethnic tensions. When Agwati tries to convince villagers to vote for him, they demand financial handouts. But the novel ends on a hopeful note, that little by little, the younger generation are realizing what has been taken from them and are mobilizing to take it back. Key themes, like the fate of Africa's youth, the illusion of a better life abroad, and the way corruption and negative ethnicity destroys a country's future. Lumumba's characters, Agwati and Sabina, should be working in positions of leadership in their country. They are well educated and naturally capable.
Education is the equalizer because it is still true that the mind is the standard of a human being. No matter how tall you are, if your mind does not work well, you are just a tall fool.
But they live in a system which appeals to the lowest common denominator, to prejudice and short-term greed. So even with the arrival of multi-party democracy, problems persist in a toxic culture of corruption.
Democracy presupposes that the electorate is mature and the electorate knows what it wants. You know, 3 days ago, an individual from my ethnic group called me and he told me this time round we are taking it. And I said, who are we? And he told me, don't you know? I knew what he was saying, of course. And immediately I told him, never, ever appeal to my ethnic sensibilities. I did not go to school that I vote individuals because they come from my ethnic group.
And so, the task assigned to moral, educated people is not to enjoy the promised land, but to fight to clean it.
And that is why I think introducing what we have called hygiene in politics is critical.
Lumumba loves the metaphor of hygiene. Lumumba's call for hygiene is designed to empower Africans. It's also important to recognize things which can disempower Africa.
The intervention that we see from Western donor organizations will never, ever help Africa. They may appear to do so, but they are purely anodinal. They make you not feel the pain, but ultimately they will ensure that you are incapable of doing the simple things that you can do.
Nairobi's largest slum, Kibera, is an NGO factory, and the failure of charities to solve sanitation problems shows how aid can disempower. Lack of hygiene is always a sign of disempowerment. Equally ambiguous is the role of religion in Africa. Lumumba is a Christian, but he hasn't been afraid to call out Christianity, which disempowers Africans.
Africa can rise and Africa will rise, but it's not going to rise by prayer and fasting.
But despite these criticisms, Lumumba will accept an offer to preach a sermon at churches of all denominations, because Lumumba is not just a social crusader, he's a politician who takes allies where he can find them in his goal to spread a message of African unity and empowerment. Lumumba's first close friendship with an African statesman was in Tanzania. For several years he had been saying very positive things about President Magufuli in his speeches. In 2020, he was invited to the State House to meet and talk with the president in person.
And he is the first president in this continent who has taken the step to invite me at a very short notice to have a long conversation on Africa.
As Lumumba's speeches have gone viral on the internet, he has become an attractive friend for African leaders. In these meetings, Lumumba uses his influence to promote a Pan-African vision, calling on leaders to consider allowing free movement between borders and creating shared currencies. Since Magufuli's death, Lumumba has courted President Museveni in Uganda. His tweet in support of the harsh new law creating a media storm in South Africa. For Lumumba, Museveni is a vital ally in his campaign to encourage the creation of an East African Federation, uniting Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya.
When history is written, Your Excellency, I want it to be said of you that as the elder statesman in East Africa, you presided over the creation of an East African Federation.
In April 2024, Kenyan MPs were vetting the nation's new diplomats. Candidates were recommended by the president and then interviewed by a committee. Several candidates seemed like underqualified yes-men, but it was Charles Kieru who made headlines. Nominated to represent Kenya in Goma, DRC, now at the heart of a regional crisis, Kieru only listed the role petrol station attendant on his CV. On his desk he had a list of papers with what he should say, but rather than asking him about the role, the committee asked he define GDP and balance of trade.
And what your understanding of the GDP is? The growth per the current population and the escalation of the population of that country. GDP generally is the population of a country. Fair enough.
He failed to define balance of trade. Kenyan MP Elijah Mamusi was frustrated asking the candidate, "How do you think qualified diplomats with PhDs feel when they see your nomination? Don't you think you should leave the position to others?" Kieru had wasted everyone's time, but he had also stolen a nomination from someone with the required experience in education. In the same month, Lumumba was in Rwanda, where he was delivering a speech on the anniversary of 1994. He might once have hoped for a nomination like Kieru's. Now he has created his own movement, a Pan-African quest for good governance. The vision is continental, but there is room for everyone.
I hold the view that is block by block, block by block.
Because, as Lumumba will tell us, we as Africans must steal Africa back from ourselves. If you enjoyed this content and would like more, please subscribe to the Africa Review on YouTube.